Hi, good evening, folks. I think we'll get started. It's about 4 minutes after 6, and I spent my 4 minutes playing with the microphone, but it works. Okay. And I have more batteries in my pocket. Good evening. My name is Ann Craig. I am the Associate Director here at the Museum of Natural and Cultural History, the cosmic lottery of museum jobs, really. I was telling Ronan earlier today. And I do want to start with a land acknowledgement, but before I give a land acknowledgement, I want to acknowledge something about land acknowledgements, which is that they can be extremely performative, especially in places like museums, who have done some of significant harm and injustice to Native people, and then we stand here and acknowledge the land and don't do anything about it. So I'm going to read the land acknowledgement because it was carefully crafted by some fabulous people here on campus, and I think it's meaningful. But I want to also tell you that we are actively working on decolonizing and indigenizing the museum. We had a wonderful workshop on Tuesday, an all staff and advisory council workshop. And we have new policies in place that I'm really proud of, that our new executive director, Todd Brady, who's in the back, has brought to the forefront since he's been here just since this last summer. And we're we're making sure it informs our exhibits, our programming, how we manage our collections, everything that we do. So I'm really proud that we're not just making an acknowledgement, but we're actually hopefully doing some meaningful work behind that. And I want to tell you that a week from this Saturday, Grand Ronde tribal member and artist Steph Littlebird will be here on Saturday at 1 p.m. and she's going to talk about land acknowledgements and what do we do now. They've been a little bit of a foundation for us, but what's the next step for places like museums and in higher education? What can we do next? I think that will be a really fabulous program, and she's going to be creating a graphic illustration of a land acknowledgement for the museum during the spring that we'll hopefully have on display by the summer. I think that'll be really fabulous. And if you have not seen her exhibit, it's up in Oregon where past is present. She's featured in the contemporary artist case, and just look for the flying birds and you will know that's Steph's work. And if you're giggling, it's because you know what I mean by flying birds. It's not the kind that fly in the sky, the other kind. Okay, so with that in mind, the University of Oregon's land acknowledgement. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi. Hopefully that is a common phrasing to you at this point. These are the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, which is where Steph is a member, and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their community at U of O and across the land we now call Oregon, and I would also say around the world. So with that, we hope you will continue to investigate and learn more about land acknowledgements wherever you hear them out in your world. So tonight, we are delighted to welcome Ronan Donovan to the Museum of Natural and Cultural History. We're surrounded by Ronan's work here in the gallery, which has been really wonderful to have. People are loving it. And we're going to hear more about his experiences and how that shapes the conservation photography that he engages in. I picked out a few choice things about Ronan. So Ronan has degrees in international business and economics, with a minor in environmental conservation. Graduating from the University of New Hampshire at Durham, he interviewed and got a job at a finance firm, of course, and decided instead to take a position as a wildlife biologist and coming to the good side at Yosemite National Park, and the rest is probably history. We'll hear about the journey between then and now, maybe. But some more of the technical stuff. Donovan taught himself the technical aspects of photography and filmmaking while working for 8 years on a series of wildlife biology projects. So has experience in wildlife biology, which included work from Uganda to Yellowstone and beyond. And in 2013, just 10-ish years ago, decided to pursue photography and filmmaking full-time, knowing that this could have more of an impact doing the visual storytelling than the actual biologist work. And here at the museum, we certainly know that. We see that all the time as we see people learning and relearning and rethinking about how they see the world around them and how important it is to have exhibits like this and to engage in dialogue. So we're glad you're doing this work too. So please join me in welcoming Ronan.
Thank you, Anne, for the great introduction. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. Thanks for making time this evening. It's really fun to be in this space with all these animals and heartbeats around us, and be able to tell you some more stories about them tonight. I thought it'd be fun to jump in and share some imagery from the high Arctic, just as kind of a place setting, get us into that awe and wonder space, and give you a quick little update as well. Some of the characters that are surrounding us here. Most of these wolves from the Ellesmere Island in Canada side are from the Polygon Pack, as we call them. And this was just this past summer. This is one of the individuals that we named Gray Mane. He was kind of a rambunctious yearling when I was first there in 2018. Now he's getting on in his years. And his sister, we call the Bright Eyes. She's the old grandma now. This is her last summer, fresh notch in her ear. And she was very relaxed this time of year when I was there. She was hanging out with the pups. The rest of the pack were going off and hunting. There were 14 adults and 5 pups with the Polygon Pack this past summer. And she would hang out and caretake and dig for lemmings. It was a big rodent year in the Arctic. That's probably why she gets so filthy and haggard. She's been shoulder deep in lemming holes trying to get a snack. I'm going to play a short little video here that I filmed last summer. I spent 2 weeks by myself with the wolves and had a camera, of course. So I'll just play this for a couple minutes and then we'll get back into it. Those little foxes were a real treat to have around camp. They hadn't seen humans before. There were 3 little fox kits just a quarter mile away from where I set up this little base camp. And they first started coming around, inspecting, being curious. And then by the end of it, they were so relaxed that I wake up and they just be curled up little balls, little fluff balls, and you know, animals kind of watch you with their ears and they don't bother moving because they can just see you with their ears. That's what they would start doing towards the end. I'm gonna just back up a little bit and give a little more intro about who I am, where I'm from, and then we'll get back into some of the wolf work. I'm a rural kid, grew up in Vermont. It's just learning how to walk and crawl around our golden retriever puppies. My parents were both educators, and so we would go on these nature walks around our house, and my mom would write in her neat handwriting the animals we saw. And I realize this is a lot of what I do now still. I go out and take pictures, detailed notes, come back and share it. A lot of people don't know, but I started out in fashion. Sweet. Look at those knees. Learned some valuable lessons when I was younger. This is a post hole. They're building a barn. My parents were. This is pre-cell phone, just have to say. So someone found me in the hole and had to go back to the house, get the camera, come back, take the picture. It's probably why I look so distraught. Looking ahead, when I was a teenager and all through school, I struggled deeply with sitting still, with conforming. I was labeled oppositional defiant. I was always getting in trouble with peers and with adults. And so I started trying to impress the wrong group of friends, trying to be cool in the kind of bad boy way, and had 2 felonies and 4 misdemeanors when I was 13. And so my parents thankfully rallied behind me and found this emotional growth camp that was based out of Bend. And I spent 2 months at this camp in Southeast Oregon. The program was called TREX. And it was a very important time for me. I had a 14th birthday under this tarp tent. And I think about this now, reflecting back on it. And this was very much an intentional, remove me from my place, physically and emotionally, kind of separate me and isolate me from my group. And we'd go on a week-long backpack trip. Then we had a 4-day solo. And then we did like a week-long group intensive where you were guided with a therapist and a situation in a group. And it reminded me now, looking back, there's a quote I'll share from a psychologist, Bill Plotkin. And he writes that, "I believe the root cause of the dire crisis and challenges of our time, all of our currently cascading environmental and cultural collapses, is a widespread failure in individual human development." And so he thinks about that as a lack of initiation ceremonies in the modern context and the lack of individual human health. And this for me was one of those pivotal points where I was taken out of my group, went through a series of emotional and physical challenges, and then came back and was able to reintegrate back into the group. And mentioned a little bit about some of the past that I went through, but made it through college, course corrected, eventually made it to Yosemite National Park and did a really inspiring internship doing research on spotted owls. And so our job as a field crew was to capture, band, and monitor spotted owls all through Yosemite National Park, which growing up in Vermont, where we've had 2 or 3 rotations of logging, I had never seen old growth, and we were camping out under giant sequoia trees, watching spotted owls. And it reminded me of another quote that I'll share that was very exciting to be in this place at this time, immersed in wildlife and research. This is a quote from Daniel Quinn from a book called Ishmael. "People need more than to be scolded, more than to be made to feel stupid and guilty. They need more than a vision of doom. They need a vision of the world and of themselves that inspires them." And that summer and the following summer that I spent in Yosemite was very much a world that inspired me. And it was the transition that led me to photography. I picked up a film camera when I was there, started learning from the peers around me, reading as much as I could, becoming obsessed with the craft of photography. This was all film, so trying to understand metering and learning how to photograph things and then wait a month to find out if you succeeded or failed. Mostly failures, but that was part of the process and part of the learning that I was immersed with and obsessed with. And then just started taking my camera with me everywhere I went and photographing wildlife. Any guesses what this is? This is a spadefoot toad. I have them in eastern Montana. They're a desert adapted prairie species. They're called spadefoots. They have a hard keratin pad on their hind feet that they use to twist down into the sandy soils where they spend about 9 months a year underground. And they come up just for a little while to breed, lay eggs and eat and head back down. This is what they look like. And so this was doing wildlife work for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks for the state of Montana. We're doing baseline field surveys for non-game species, all the small critters. These are the tadpoles of spadefoot toads, and this was kind of a fun little learning moment for me. Took this picture, came back, asked the biologist that I was working for, what's with this big guy here in the middle? And he said, well, these are prairie adapted species, and so when the water temperature starts to get to a certain degree, meaning it's evaporating that pool, a few of the tadpoles will become cannibals and start gobbling up the other tadpoles, so that at least one or two will metamorphose, leave the water and carry on the species, which is a fascinating time to be immersed in wildlife and photography and learning. And then in 2011, I had another big change in kind of my career path and trajectory, was spending a year researching chimpanzees in Uganda. And these were habituated chimps. They had been studied for about 30 years by a professor named Richard Wrangham, who was mostly at Harvard during his career. He first started under Jane Goodall, and he was studying human evolutionary biology through the better understanding of chimp behaviors. And so I was actually there using photography as a research tool. Again, these chimps are totally accustomed to people. Most of them have spent at least half their life, if not their entire life, around humans. And so you got to witness some pretty fun events, a little food sharing moment here between mom and infant. Mom's got those big jaws, and she can chew up these dense fruits that allow for the young ones to get a free meal, an easy meal. Some of them are still learning about fruits and how to eat them. And one of the things that I was asked to do while I was there by Richard was to climb the trees and photograph and film some of the behaviors that chimps engage in high in the canopy. And so this was using some of the early childhood rope techniques, rock climbing that my dad had taught me, and then later doing the spotted owl work. There was another field assistant there that was doing a nest cavity measuring survey, so he needed help tree climbing, so he taught me how to tree climb, just kind of a series of events that enabled me to do this. And be up in the trees. And then this eventually series of images were the images that initially were seen by National Geographic, and essentially my kind of foot in the door. And so I would spend weeks up in the tree. I'd come down at night and sleep in a bed, but I would go through the forest in the dark early morning and get there before the chimps would. This is a really fantastic tree. It's called the Ficus capensis. What's really beautiful about it is the fruits that the chimps were eating in the previous photos. They're big, kind of grape size, some were even kiwi size, but they grow off the trunk. So these big kind of bushels, which is different than a lot of other fig trees where the fruits grow out where the leaves are, which means they spread the chimps out, and it's harder to see them when they're out in the leaves. But here you can really get a view of how many chimps there are on the tree. And so I'm there, you know, I'm a terrestrial ape, and I got my ropes and all my tools, and the chimps are literally up there just kind of swinging in the breeze. Super relaxed. They spend 2/3 of their life in the trees. They sleep up there. They make nests every night in a different tree and hang out. And so one of the characters that I met while I was there, they were all had names for research purposes, was Max. And Max was an 11-year-old chimp at the time in 2011. He was a lot like the rest of the chimps. He was moving around through the forest with his family group, looking for different fruits and ripe things to eat. He likes to chat about his food here. Like how he's thumbing his leg, he's really getting into it. But there was a situation that was unique to Max that I couldn't really look away from, that he had lost both of his feet to poacher snares. These were two separate incidents, one when he was 7, one when he was 9. These happened before I was there as a researcher. And it was hard for me to just collect data and try to understand these behaviors when there were obviously these really challenging life events that were happening to these chimpanzees. These snares, I should say, are set not for chimps. There's a taboo against eating primates in Uganda. But the chimps are strong enough that they would get caught on them, they'd rip themselves free, but then they'd have a knot that was attached to a limb. Some chimps had feet, some chimps had hands that had been missing. And it was a big turning point for me in terms of being just in the science world, just in data collection, and not trying to communicate this. And so I started to try to help tell this story a bit more by telling Max's story, sharing more about his life history. As you can see here, he still is able to move through the forest. He received no medical attention. The veterinarians couldn't get to him when these injuries happened. His wounds calloused over. It's a pretty amazing testament to the resilience of wild animals. And so that was 2011. And for 8 years after, I worked on a story to try to get this into National Geographic magazine. Initially, when those images were shown to an editor of National Geographic, they needed more of a story than just chimps in the canopy and maybe just 1 or 2 pictures of Max or these other snare injured chimps. They needed more context, more information. And so I started to try to unravel a bit of the reasons or the causes that would lead to these chimps suffering from these snare injuries. And a lot of it just has to do with subsistence farming and subsistence hunting that people were doing along the borders of these national parks. And this is a drone image that I took years later after being there in 2011. And it very well depicts this idea of these boundaries that we in the modern world create that are between, the human world and the wild world, this idea that we're separate from. And very much, it is a very different and separated landscape, but obviously the chimps don't understand that and don't know that. They used to roam freely and use all this landscape before it was developed. This is an even more extreme place where this is a small forest patch that has about 20 chimps that live here. Different family of chimps. This is all surrounded by a patch of sugar cane and export. And so I started working on this story and unraveling these challenges. And what I discovered was in Uganda, there's about 5,000 chimps total, and the majority of those live in protected areas, but there's about 1,000 chimps that live outside of protected areas, places like this, that are either kind of like our version of Forest Service, kind of like federal land that's used and logged, or even more extreme places where there are no forests left. And the chimps are literally just kind of in little parks, little kind of swamps is where a lot of the time they would end up being, because it's the only place that they couldn't turn into farmland. And so this situation was kind of the crux or the climax of this challenge, where chimps were getting into physical altercations with people and vice versa. Chimps are territorial social apes. We as humans are territorial social apes. We use tools, we hunt things for meat, and chimps do the same. And when you have them living in close proximity to people, this family, the Samata family, built this fence around their backyard to try to keep the chimps away from their kids, but they didn't succeed. The mother here, Junie, was going to get water one day, and the chimps grabbed her 1.5-year-old son, and the son ended up being killed by the chimps. And this particular village has had 10 kids that have been killed by the same group of chimps. And it's a challenging conservation issue. It remains that way. We did a story for National Geographic, written by David Quammen, outlining and highlighting this issue. This Teddy Atuhera, she was attacked by a chimp when she was 4 and had her arm amputated as a result. The map we made on the right-hand side highlights these kind of hotspot areas where there are groups of chimps that have essentially learned to target humans as food, especially kids, because they're smaller and vulnerable. But essentially, what's happened is human population growth, deforestation, and since chimps are not on the menu, the forests are cleared and the chimps essentially remain in these small little forest patches. And it's a challenging conservation issue because a lot of this is imposed by the Western world that we have to conserve chimps. We have to save these animals because we know Jane Goodall, we know chimps are intelligent and closely related to humans. But for people that live alongside a lot of these animals, they're competitors on the landscape, or they're a danger to them. And so the government in Uganda, pressured by NGOs and outside tourism, tells people they have to live alongside these animals. They have to learn to live alongside them, which is something that we in the first world would never ask of. If animals are a nuisance to us, or if we just simply like to hunt them, we have that right. And in this part of the world, these people don't have the power that a lot of us have to be able to stand up. So this was kind of a big turning point for the work that I do in terms of trying to help give voices to people and places and animals that don't have that option. And so that's kind of the work that I do now is very much mission driven. Let's talk about wolves. This is a talk about the human wolf connection. I didn't think you're gonna hear about chimps tonight, but I think it's all relevant and tied in. So we'll spend the next half of this talk talking about wolves. How many of you have seen wild wolves? Yeah, it's about a quarter of you. Nice. So how many of you have dogs or have lived in a house that has a dog? Yeah, even more of us, right? Yeah, this is a very unique relationship that we have between humans and wolves, or humans and dogs. Dogs are just a subspecies of wolf that we domesticated. This is from the National Geographic article years ago, just illustrating the lineage of dogs that goes back millions and millions of years, and all these different migrations of canids back and forth from Eurasia to North America and back and forth over millions of years. And then eventually somewhere in there, we did this. We, took a wild wolf, we made some funny things out of it. We made dachshunds, we made bulldogs that can't give birth naturally. They need to have, C-sections now to give birth, but they look cool, I guess. Little French bulldog and other things, but yeah, we have this relationship with canids that is unlike any other. They're the first animal we domesticated somewhere in the 20,000 years ago range. There's a loose thread, a book called Invaders, that talks about the potential that hominids, that humans, Homo sapiens, potentially outcompeted Neanderthals by the use of dogs helping to hunt. Kind of interesting. Just one of the thoughts. Thinking of wolves in North America, this is a map that we made. It's actually for this exhibit, and I'll just help us through it. Historic wolf range used to go all the way down into Mexico. These are gray wolves that we're talking about. This wolf here is the red wolf, and it's a different wolf, a little smaller. It's actually endemic to North America. It evolved in North America, whereas gray wolves came across the land bridge. But there's only about 18 left. And they only live in North Carolina. They were reintroduced after being captured, all of them in their wild habitat and bred for years to try to bring them back. But a lot of challenges with poaching and crossbreeding with coyotes. Coyotes used to be just a Western species, but through colonization and the changing of the landscape by modern humans, they started to backfill to the east and kind of come into these areas that they used to be. So we're looking at the dark area is where wolves are currently, all the way up into Ellesmere, which I'll talk about later. Yellowstone's here, Northern Idaho and Yellowstone were two reintroduction sites as well that I'll talk about. Mexican gray wolves here, another subspecies that was a reintroduction site. And then we're getting more, this is Oregon, getting more wolves here, and they're starting to travel down into California as well. But yeah, just a kind of a context to get us thinking about where wolves were and where they are. We have this dotted line for this map that I wanted to point out. This is the minimum range that wolves were essentially hunted, trapped, and poisoned to. So that's like kind of how far north they were pushed. This is in the last 200 years. And so they've only kind of been allowed to come back down. That's little areas to fill in. I thought that was useful to point that out. But thinking about that context, this is a 1914 archival image from Arizona. These are government trappers, paid people to hunt and trap and poison wolves. There's only one wolf here left. It's the one in the middle. These are all coyotes. And then this is a bobcat. That guy's holding. And this picture reminds me of a quote from Barry Lopez that reads, "Throughout the centuries, we have projected onto the wolf the qualities we most despise and fear in ourselves." So this was kind of an all-out war that we projected onto these predators, but it wasn't unique to predators. Obviously, and as Anne mentioned, there were people involved, millions of people that lived on this continent that were pushed and eradicated and moved. And similarly, that happened with bison and elk and deer and turkeys and wolves and bears and cougars. This is a glue works factory. People came up with creative ways to utilize bone. It's also used for fertilizer on landscapes. So just wanted to point out that it wasn't unique to predators, it wasn't unique to wolves, this war on the landscape and against them. So thinking about wolves in Yellowstone in the context of those animals being absent for 70 years. No wolves in landscape park policy was to remove them. And then in 1994, 95, they started to bring them back and reintroduce them to the landscape, 1995, 96. And then they start to research wolves. And so the way they do that is through collaring operations, which are pretty intense. They use a dart gun and they put a tranquilizer into a wolf. This is Doug Smith putting a dart into the rump of that wolf to be able to understand and better track their movements and their interactions with the landscape and prey and their ranges throughout. These are 3 sleepy wolves. They're getting fitted with 2 GPS collars. You can see that kind of silver box on the closest wolf here. But this is a very human dominated landscape as well in a lot of ways in terms of it's heavily managed through research. It's still a national park. There's still a lot of wilderness area, but these wolves were introduced under an experimental population designation, which means they can be researched and they can be kind of heavily managed in that way. And there's a lot of benefits to that for sure. It's the place that gives us this foundation understanding about wolves in the landscape, helps us better understand what they eat. In Yellowstone, 95% of their food are elk, which is the most abundant prey, most abundant ungulate. And so these guys are going in doing what's called a cluster search, where they have a cluster of GPS points on the landscape and they go and ski in or hike in. This is done in the wintertime. And they will survey maybe a week after the wolves have been to this site, try to figure out what they'd eaten, and they collect a cross-section of femur, which gives them an indication of the health of the animal. And then they can also take a lower jaw, which helps them also to age the animals. And essentially what this has been able to understand is that wolves have a hard time taking big, healthy animals. They weigh, a fifth of the size of an elk, a wolf does. And so they take young animals, weakened animals that are either old or sick, which is essentially what we would kind of think of as what wolves do. And this is an illustration about the idea of keystone species, which is relatively new to the scientific world. It's only been around for a term, at least, to the modern world. It's been around for about 50 years. And the idea is that when a keystone species like wolves or beavers are absent from the landscape, biodiversity decreases. And that's what they're trying to illustrate in this National Geographic painting, this illustration on the left. And then on the right side is when wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park. And this idea that they thinned out the elk herd, they changed their behaviors, they started moving them through the landscape in different ways, as well as benefiting grizzly bears and pronghorn, the small critters and birds.
Beavers.
And yeah, they reintroduced beavers at the same time as wolves. A lot of people don't know that, but they kind of under the radar dropped off 30 beavers in the northern part of just over the border on the Forest Service property in Yellowstone. And so beavers are coming back as well into Yellowstone, which is great. And so this idea when keystone species are present in the landscape, biodiversity is going to increase. And the benefit of biodiversity on a landscape is it makes it more resilient to change. So diseases or weather patterns or big catastrophic events that come through a landscape, the more biodiverse it is, the better it is, the healthier it is, the more resilient it is. Similar to us, like think of our microgut biome. When it's really biodiverse and cranking, we're healthy as well, similar to the landscapes. But there's still a lot of challenges with wolves on landscapes, even in places like Yellowstone, where they've been on the ground for 30 years. This was a hunt that happened a couple of years ago, where 25 wolves that spend 95% of their time inside the borders of Yellowstone National Park, that were born in Yellowstone National Park, were hunted outside of the border. This is all done legally, it's allowed. But we also, I mentioned poaching and challenges in Uganda with chimps. That is still something that happens here as well, and in Oregon especially. But this white wolf here, this is one of the oldest wolves in Yellowstone, and she was shot in 2017 inside Yellowstone National Park. So still just a challenging place to be wolves, even though it's a place that's our first national park and has all this attention on it and all this research. It's still challenging to figure out ways for modern humans to live on the landscape with these animals. And so Ellesmere, we're going to come back, we're going to round this out. It's going to be a little more cheery for the second half of this. Ellesmere is a place where humans have moved through and lived and continue to move through and tried to make a living off of this place. The Arctic is a very hard place to live for a equatorially evolved ape, which we all are. Essentially what we do in the north as northern humans traditionally is we would wear the animals that evolved on that landscape. That's how we did it. And that's how people in the north did it. There are multiple ways of people that moved across this landscape. And currently, when you go really far north in the Arctic, there aren't very many people, or in this context where I am in northern Ellesmere Island, there's no human habitation in this region. So there's no hunting or trapping. Interactions they have with humans are maybe coming by a weather station where there's 8 Canadian government people that run a station there and checking out human things and peeing on things and smelling them and seeing what humans are about. But there's no targeting. There's no kind of negative encounters. There's no research, there's no collaring efforts that go on. And so the idea is it kind of gives a little window into this human wolf relationship that is hard to find nowadays. And so what I do when I'm up there and how a lot of these images were captured is follow the wolves around. We use ATVs, 4-wheelers, or we're on foot, and we're able to follow the wolves as they move through the landscape, looking for food. Musk oxen are the main food that they use. But it also allows for some of these quieter scenes that I'm drawn to more so than some of the louder hunting kind of heavy metal wolf imagery that a lot of times we see, because this is how wolves spend most of their days. Anybody who has a dog is probably pretty familiar with how they spend their days. They're snoozing, they're hanging out, they're lounging, they're tending to each other. This is a remote camera, this is a motion triggered image. I'm not actually physically there. But in Yellowstone, when I was there, I didn't get to see these kinds of intimate scenes. You can't get legally within 300 feet of a wolf, but also wolves wouldn't allow you to get more than a quarter mile before they would start to get nervous and move away. And so Ellesmere allows, in terms of photography and imagery and storytelling, a bit more of an authentic view into the lives of wild wolves and a bit more of a full picture. This is Bright Eyes again. This is just from last summer. In her golden years in that golden light. I'm going to share a video here that is helpful in kind of trying to reframe some of the ideas around the human wolf relationship. A lot of people ask me if I'm spending time with wolves that aren't fearful of people, then am I scared? Am I on the menu? Have I ever been bitten or snarled at or attacked? No. And this video kind of helps a little bit to make us think a little differently about the relationship and the possibilities.
Just shaking them down. Footballs. It's your meal. Looks fresh. Yeah. Girl. Maybe that. No.
So I share that not as like, hey, look how cool it is that I got close to this wolf. I haven't posted this on social media, even though it's years old. I only use it in talks to illustrate just this different idea that this wolf isn't trying to rip my throat out or do anything other than the age-old game of keep away. What she wants to do is get the corner of my pad, tear it off, and have me chase her. 'Cause that's fun. I mean, we've all done that with dogs. And she obviously has no idea what I'm saying. They've never been trained, but they understand a little bit more of context and body positioning and posture and movement. And they respect us in that form, that weird bipedal, great ape thing that walked around the landscape. And I look back and think about early domestication of wolves, and it didn't happen once. And the more reading I've done about it, learning that it happened thousands of times independently, all through history for thousands of years. There's oral stories just from Northwest Montana from like 250 years ago of people domesticating or finding a pup in a den that had been flooded. There's like one pup that's still alive and bringing it in and raising it for a couple of years and going on adventures, and they let the animal go. It went off and then was wild again. So this is something that's happened over and over again. And before going to Ellesmere, I had no idea that like how we ever domesticated wolves. But being here on this island and seeing these wolves and engaging with them, you can understand pretty quickly how it was done. Just going to close with a little bit of an update on Ellesmere specifically, and what's happening there in the context of climate change. A lot of people ask, do I see evidence of climate change? What's happening? And the answer is yes, and it's happening very rapidly. And in the form currently on Ellesmere, there is a bacterial infection that is wreaking havoc on muskoxen. And so this is a naturally occurring bacteria on the landscape. And we have it on all continents outside of Antarctica. But the strain on Ellesmere and in the Arctic is pretty intense, apparently, in terms of how quickly it moves through the population. So there's been 90% declines of muskoxen on other islands further south in the Arctic. On Ellesmere, it was just discovered in 2021. I was there filming for a series called Planet Earth, and we started finding dead muskoxen and got to about 15 animals. And then I satellite texted a biologist, Dr. Susan Coots, and she's from the University of Calgary. And she was very alarmed and scrambled a lot of resources, a hard place to get to ever. And she was able to find funding and came up for 3 days that summer and sampled. And then she's been back every summer since. This was last summer. I was up there with her and her team. And it's one of the things that is pretty alarming in terms of climate change. And Susan Coots is someone trying to unravel that story. You know, when I think of climate change, or when a lot of us think of climate change, we think of big catastrophic things like sea level rise as a result of melting glaciers, or we think of catastrophic weather events, inclement things in the environment happening. But I didn't think of small things like bacteria that's naturally on the landscape, just kind of getting a little haywire because the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world. And so Susan and her team are thinking of the terrestrial landscapes of the north as like a bellwether for what could happen in latitudes further south, as maybe this land warms at 4 times the current rate. And so that's a little hard to stomach, I understand, but it's something that is important that we think about and engage in. And the work that I do is very much about trying to highlight these places that we hear about, but we don't necessarily see the people that live there, or the animals that live there, or the challenges that are happening in these faraway places. So I'm going to end by reading a quote that's just about creating some different stories and different narratives. This is a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer from a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And she says, "We need to unearth the old stories that live in a place and begin to create new ones. For we are story makers, not just storytellers." And so I think of that as we need to create new stories of how we interact with wildlife, how we interact with each other, and how we act with the landscape in order to move through the challenges that are ahead. Thank you all for your time.
We do have time for questions. If folks want to ask questions, then I'll turn on the lights.
Sounds great. And if anybody has to boogie and head home, no worries, get up and head out, no problem at all. But yeah,
I want
questions.
to know what happened to the wolves. If the muskoxen are dying like that, what did you see in the wolf population?
Can you repeat the question, Ronan, so everybody can hear?
The question was about how the wolf population is doing in response to or as a result of the muskox population declining. So Susan thinks that on Ellesmere and the adjacent island, Axel Heiberg, which is kind of in the similar landmass, there's this map here, this is Axel Heiberg, so it's kind of this whole area of Ellesmere and Axel Heiberg. She thinks the population's halved in the last 3 years, muskoxen. And what we've seen in the wolf population is a increase. So I showed a picture of the carcass on the landscape. So there's thousands of carcasses on the landscape, which leads to a short-term boom in wolf population because of the amount of meat on the landscape. In 2021, when I was there, we didn't find any evidence of breeding in wolves. There's no pups in the 2-3 packs that we checked out. Polygon pack being one of them, another pack that I didn't know of, but we went and spent time with them. Don't know what that was about. Could have been related to the bacteria. But this past year, when I was there, the pack was 14 adults and 5 pups, which is the biggest pack that I've heard of there. So they're obviously doing well in this short time frame, while there's kind of an increase in the food. And the muskox population, to put a little bit of a happier note on it, they are doing a little bit better, like those that have survived. They have higher calf counts this past summer than they did. So the calves are surviving, or the females are carrying weight better, so they're able to reproduce. So the population, like, it's part of the disease flow is that when you have a decline, we dealt with it with COVID, you have people that build up resistance to it, and that's beneficial in the long run to the animals. I mean, muskoxen went to 2 very severe genetic bottlenecks over the last 10,000 years, one at the end of the last ice age, and then one as a result of human over-harvesting and hunting in the last 200 years. So they've kind of come from these really small populations, which is why it makes them very much more susceptible to it. Any other questions? Forsten?
All of the wolves I've seen in Ellesmere are white.
Mhm.
All the wolves, when I hang out in Minnesota, are gray or black, or most of them are gray or black.
Mhm.
It looks like the ones in Yellowstone are gray and black and white. Does that mean anything?
Yeah, so the question, if anyone didn't hear it, but it's about the coat colors of wolves in the Arctic. You know, they're white, but then wolves down here, and you can see in some of these images, you know, these are black wolves, this is a black wolf, but there's gray wolves, there's kind of a mix. So wolves in North America, they were either Arctic white wolves, so that's adapted to white landscape. It's only snow-free for about 3 months out of the year. So like the foxes turn white in the winter, the ptarmigans do as well. For some reason, Arctic hares don't. They stay white all year round, but that's another conversation. So Arctic wolves, white landscape, white wolves, they were all gray colored wolves in North America until humans came with domesticated versions of wolves about 20-30,000 years ago, depending, different waves that humans came across from Eurasia, and they brought domesticated wolves in the form of just, you know, big dogs. And one of the weird things about domestication, there's a long-term study that came out of Russia that was looking at basically 50 years of breeding selectively foxes, but they were selecting the breeding based on the young fox's temperament. So were they kind of curious to humans, or indifferent, or were they snarling and mean, or were they terrified? So the indifferent ones, the kind of curious ones, they just kept breeding those. They bred the others for controls, but they kept breeding the curious ones that were indifferent. And weird things started happening, like their coat color started changing, their tails started curling, their bone structures got smaller, their skull structures got smaller. They basically turned into permanent puppies.
Whoa.
Which is what we've done. Like dogs are basically wolves stunted at age 1. Like we don't actually want a full, mature adult, mentally, cognitively, and like physically primed wolf like around. Like they're just they'd be a lot of work. You have working dogs, so you know, like we've kind of carved that off in certain other behaviors. But the black coat color is from domesticated wolves that came across, and that coat color then they bred with wild wolves, and that's where the black coat color comes in the wolves in North America now. So it's kind of like a throwback to breeding way back when with domestic animals, and they're slightly less aggressive. This is all from Yellowstone observations, so 30 years of visual observations of group encounters, and the black wolves have a little little less aggression in them, which is interesting. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I had a quick comment. There have been humans killed by wolves. In Alaska, there were, women, they were little petite women, and they were running at night. And it was juvenile wolves, so that has happened. I know that earlier in the last century, people used to do a thing where they take a chimpanzee and they'd have a fight the strongest man in the town or whatever. Now, so, an adult can't take on a chimpanzee, right?
Yeah, so I'll comment on the first thing. So yeah, there's been maybe 6 to 8 human fatalities in North America recorded in the last 100 years from wolves. Those have all happened in Canada or in Alaska. A lot of them were in kind of interesting situations of like a mining camp that had semi-habituated wolves, or around a community of people that kind of had wolves that became overly used to people. Definitely happens, definitely have capacity. Running around predators is a bad idea in general. There are, and also to say, there's been thousands of wolf fatalities that have killed people in Europe and Asia over the last few thousand years. Barry Lopez talks about it of wolves and men. He makes a comment about the majority of those were rabid animals, so people didn't die from the wolf attack. They died later, but they still were, killed by wolves. And then a lot of the others would be hybridized animals with domestic dogs. So like there was a famous case in France where maybe 25, 30 people were killed by a couple of wolves. They eventually caught the animals. They had bred with mastiffs and were very large and not fearful of humans. So they were kind of like a human cause situation. Chimp human interaction. Yeah, there was some weird like circus fair stuff that would go on where they would take the teeth out of a chimp so they couldn't bite people, and bring them into the ring and have them fight with some strong guy. And chimps are about 5 times stronger than humans on average. We're the only ape that floats, so that's a testament to our like upright mobility and lightweight structure, so that we can move through the landscape quickly. All the other apes have super dense bone structures, denser muscle fibers, so they sink like rocks. Also makes them really strong in like size ratio of muscles. So yeah, we don't want to be fighting chimps. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about the change in the ecosystem in Yellowstone after the bulls were reintroduced, and the effect because of what happened with the elk?
Yeah, the question's about the change on the landscape of Yellowstone as a result of wolves coming back on the landscape and how they affected elk. So essentially, with wolves being gone for 70 years from the landscape in Yellowstone, the reason for that, or the story that was in the minds of people back in the early 1900s, was that you had to save the prey by cleansing the landscape of the predators. And what happened, and they figured this out pretty quickly up in the 60s, 70s, the elk population was through the roof, and the Park Service actually started culling elk inside Yellowstone National Park. They were seeing some really harsh winters where like 3,000 elk would die because they're overgrazing the landscape, and they would starve and go very underweight into winter. And so the park that was part of why they came around to the idea of reintroducing wolves, is because the park was realizing we're having to do all this heavy management to act as predators. And so they started to be open to the idea of having wolves back on landscape. And so wolves were introduced in 1995 and 96 into Yellowstone. And elk populations were probably 3 times what they naturally should be. Certain herd within Yellowstone. There's probably 12 herds that migrate in and out of Yellowstone National Park. Most people talk only about the northern herd, which is out of Gardner, which is kind of a Gardner mammoth, the northern part of the park. And that herd, probably around 20,000 wolves came back, dropped down to maybe 5,000 or 6,000. Now it's back up to around 9,000. And also what was happening at that same time with that herd was that people were harvesting about 3,000 cow elk of winter, which is a lot of elk, like 1 to 3,000. And if you want to drop the population, which is what the management was trying to do, you hunt cows, you hunt females. So those two things happened at once and dropped the population down to probably a more sustainable level, and now it's back up. The wolves in Yellowstone, their highest number is probably 150 animals. They've kind of leveled out at 100 average for Yellowstone, which 2 million acres, 100 wolves, not a lot. Yellowstone in general is pretty marginal habitat. for everything. It's high elevation, average 8,000 feet. We think of it as kind of like this time capsule of what things used to be and what it could be everywhere, but it's a very unique high elevation super volcano in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, which translates to a really hard place to be in winter. And so most of the animals migrate out, spend time down lower elevations. And so we think of Yellowstone as kind of like this perfect idea, and we can learn a lot from it, but it isn't like great habitat. You know, we've taken up all the really good habitat for farming, for towns and cities. And so Yellowstone's still kind of, it's amazing, but it's also like, we have to take it with the understanding that it isn't the best place to be an elk or a bison or a pronghorn. And most of them leave the park in winter. So the elk population in Yellowstone, like it's interesting to think about, like Yellowstone's kind of at its best since it was labeled a national park in terms of all the animals that existed, 300 years ago, pre-European contact are back there now. Still have a lot of challenges. Most of the challenges now are with bison, not necessarily wolves, but it's trying to understand kind of how that dynamic works in the landscape. Yes, in the back.
How
Uh-huh.
and you talk is this communication, is it are they singing? Can you see them howling in the moon?
Sure. I think we all heard, but the question is more about howling and how wolves communicate, why they howl, like just the varying ideas of what howling is. I think of, like, we like to oversimplify behaviors in the natural world, and even behaviors in ourselves, and kind of we like things to be simple and black and white, super nuanced, like an example being like wolf teeth and the idea of their bite, and it's very scary to us, the idea, and like we think of that as a really dangerous thing, but I think of wolves' mouths as like the versions of our hands, where we can do so many different things with our hands, right? We can do violent things, we can kill things, we hold babies with our hands, wolves pick up their young with their hands, they kiss each other with their mouths, they do all these things that are very nuanced with the same tool, or the same physical attribute, and howling is very similar. So they howl when they're stressed out. I've been with a couple young wolves, yearlings that have been separated from the pack, and they were doing mournful, anxious howling that some of you maybe have dogs that have separation anxiety. You hear that howl. It's a very different type of howl, and they were doing it for hours until eventually the pack that they were trying to connect, their family, heard them and howled back, and then they sprinted over and they have a big reunion, and then they all howled together. And that is very much like a stress relieving, bonding. You can think of it as harmonizing singing, like, engaging the vagus nerve feels good. We sing, we harmonize, we chant. All these things are really powerful to us. And when wolves do it, it's very much like a ritual in a lot of ways, that they use it in all these attributes and different behaviors. So I think, yeah, they do it to get psyched when they're heading out to go hunt. They'll howl together to get everyone rallied and head out. So you can very much think of the varying noises we make in terms of singing or yelling or crying or sad, like all these different emotions that we use through vocalizations. Social animals that vocalize, they do the same. Yeah, in the back. Yeah, so the initial entry point or contact with National Geographic actually came from the professor that I was working for, Richard Wrangham. He had a PhD student, Cheryl Knott, whose husband is Tim Lehman, who used to be a PhD botanist, climbed trees in Borneo, took a camera up, photographed a bunch of high canopy animals in Borneo, and is a National Geographic photographer. And so Richard sent some photos of mine to Tim, and Tim's very gracious, kind, and supportive. And he emailed back and said, these are really interesting pictures. You should share these with National Geographic. And he essentially gave me the blueprint of, Kathy Moran is the natural history editor that you want to talk to. She's very busy. Say referred by Tim Lehman, the subject, 2 sentences attached to your best photos and a gallery to a link of like 30 photos, and then you wait. And so that was essentially through the research work that I did through Richard to Tim to Kathy, and then I waited. I mean, it's kind of hilarious to think of like how long it took me to write 2 sentences, like to obsess about what I'm gonna say. And Kathy didn't write back for, I think it was probably a month or 2. And then she wrote back and said, these are really interesting. Do you have any more? I didn't know what that meant. I was just like a scientist. I took a bunch of pictures, and I sent her 400 more pictures. And she was actually really happy about that, which was great to hear. And she edited it down to like 30, 35 pictures. I still have that edit. And then asked me, what's the story? I had no follow-up. I was like, oh, the chimps in the tree. The pictures. And she wanted to know more about what the actual reason was that I wanted to publish these images. And that was essentially a big learning point for me too, because I didn't think in stories, I thought in data, and I thought in pretty single pictures. And so that's essentially why it took 8 years to get that story published. But yeah, that was kind of the snaky way in. That happens a lot with National Geographic. I'd say about half of the photographers that I work with, they came from different career paths and then use photography as a way to communicate whatever their specialty is or whatever their expertise is. And then the other half did go through photojournalism or journalism schools. Yes.
When the wolf was approaching you, I found it kind of astonishing that you inferred one of the flags. And I wondered if you've seen other examples of interspecies playfulness and if wolves rank particularly high in that trait.
The question is about kind of the nature of play in wolves and how that wolf wanted to play with me by stealing something, and if I've seen interspecies play in other examples. Yeah, I've seen wolves do it with foxes. We'll kind of play a little game of chase, playfulness. Yeah, it doesn't happen too often. There's some interesting examples of like, there's some cool stuff coming out where people are getting photos and videos of badgers and coyotes hanging out. And so they're kind of helping each other out in the sense that like, it's not necessarily playful, it's more just mutual tolerance and respect for how they can help each other get food. But the badgers kind of act as like beaters, and they push out ground squirrels and rodents and stuff, and then the coyotes can grab them. But yeah, interspecies play. I mean, I've been invited to play by animals many times. I've been with the wolves many times, with chimps many times, mountain gorillas as well. I haven't spent as much time with mountain gorillas, but did like a 2-month assignment for National Geographic and had these 2 giant, they call them blackbacks because they hadn't yet had the testosterone puberty that turns their back silver, but they're these big males that were probably 13, 14 years old. They're having a big romp, running back and forth, having a good time, and it's great action, and I'm photographing it. And gorillas are big, they're giant, they're 400 pounds, and that's because they eat low nutritious foods, so they have big guts, so they're kind of like big cows. That's how you think of it. Like, they don't have very diverse diets, they spend 8 hours a day digesting. So when they're moving, you're like, oh, photographing them, and then these 2 wanted to play with the other ape. And so they came over to me, they grabbed my arm. So I had 4 giant gorilla hands on my arm, and they're looking up at me like, let's play, let's go. And I have a local guide, a Rwandan guy with me, and he like whispers very calmly, like, don't move. The perfect thing to say, good plan. Wasn't gonna go wrong. But yeah, it happens. And it's an interesting thing that we engage, especially as modern humans. Like, it's, you know, we're supposed to be separate journalists or scientists, we're supposed to have a wall and can't interact. And, you know, Jane Goodall found out pretty early on, when you start feeding chimps and trying to get too close to them, that it can go poorly. Like, it's, you don't want to be around chimps. They're very strong. They can be unpredictable. They just kind of react. And so it's good to have those boundaries, but it is also hard being like a fellow playful social animal that you do want to kind of engage. And I love playing with dogs and I love engaging that way, but I do keep the boundaries with wolves and other animals, just mostly for their sake. Yeah, we got one more question all the way in the back.
How you initiate or how you got close to the wolves in first place, photograph. You know, if they're within a quarter of a mile, they detect you looking for, detect them, and they move on. And yet, you know, do you take a nap out on the tundra and relying on curiosity or elsewhere? And then the second question would be, is their behavior, say, until there gets to your friends or whatever, different from when there are pups?
Two questions were, one of them's about kind of how do I find the wolves, engage with them? How's that kind of first meeting go? And the second one's about, do the wolves act differently when pups are present? And so related to the first question, the wolves on Ellesmere, they're very curious to people. And so you kind of, the way I go about it is at least for the polygon pack, that's most of the wolf images from Ellesmere are in this exhibit. And what I showed, I go to their territory, kind of their home area. I go to a high point, I sit there with binoculars. It's a brown landscape, they're bright white animals. I go during the nighttime, even though it's 24 hours of daylight. The wolves don't like the heat, they're kind of a little stressed during the summer in terms of physically, they prefer cold. And so they are active mostly during the night, even though it's still daylight. So I do that, go up high point during the night and glass with binoculars and try to spot them, and then go and kind of have the first meeting or, you know, greet them for that year when I haven't seen them for a while. And they, as soon as they know you're there, they just come. They're like, cool, let's check it out. And they come and they sniff and they do the round thing and they check you out and they get downwind and they basically see what you're about. And every wolf is an individual. There are like the pack that was 14 that I was with, the Polygon pack. So I knew 7 of them. I had spent time with them previously. Only those 7, and even within those 7, not all of them are psyched on people. Some of them won't come closer than 100 feet. They're just like, I don't know about that. I'm just going to stay around here, even though they'll see the other ones trying to steal stuff. And right here, the others will kind of be wary, and so you got to kind of gauge your distance based on everyone's comfort level. And related to the pups, how they act around the pups, it's been really interesting that the pups are often the ones that are the most shy of humans to begin with. So the first time that I met the Polygon pack, I spotted them from about a mile away. There were ravens that keyed me into them there near a carcass. They were all sleeping. I could see all these little white dots. And I just hung out for a few hours. Eventually, one of them spotted me and came over with 2 others. So there were 3 wolves that came by. And the rest of the pack, there were 6 at that time, 6 adults and 4 pups. They stayed behind, so there was 3 adults left for the pups. And the pups were the ones that got, like, all the other animals are lying down. They're totally relaxed. And the pups were like, I don't want to be near that thing. And I was still like a quarter mile away. And the pups started howling and whining and heading back to the den and like, let's get out of here, let's go. And the rest of the adults were giving no sign of fear or no sign of anxiety. But the pups are the ones that are like, I'm not into that thing. It's interesting to think about that. It's very much ingrained in their development behavior from a young age that you're wary of things in the landscape, and wary of humans, that eventually, you know, they would fall asleep in a pile and they got used to us. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm gonna share one more slide. That's just a resource slide. Anybody wants to take a picture of it, just some books, some good reading material, stuff that I've visited when I was younger, stuff that I've read recently. Yes, thank you all for coming. Appreciate your time.